Okay. Uh, Good afternoon, everybody. It's 2 minutes past the hour of 12, and welcome to today's event, which is In the Zone. What can the UK learn from planning reforms abroad? I think most, maybe not all, but most experts and commentators agree that the UK's planning system needs to be reformed, and particularly needs to be reformed if it has any chance to deliver the Labour government's growth and net zero ambitions, which have been central to what the Labour government has said thus far. Some argue for wholesale reform, and some argue for incremental reform. Today, very deliberately, and accepting that it's not the whole story, we're going to focus on the former. So we're going to think about wholesale reform and the pros and cons and the lessons learned from that, and particularly wholesale reform, that if we were to move towards more of a zone-based planning system in the UK, how would we go about that? What might we learn from zone-based systems elsewhere across the globe? What are the things that we should keep an eye out for? What are the experiences? How can we incorporate them so we make the best of it? And we've got three great panelists to explore the arguments. We've got Stu Donovan, who's a senior fellow at Motu Research, and he's based in Australia and knows a lot about New Zealand. Jenny Schuetz, who's a senior fellow at the Metro program at the Brookings Institution, knows a lot about lots of places, which is very good. And we've got my colleague Anne Breach, who's associate director at the Centre for Cities and has done a lot on the UK planning system, how it needs to change, and indeed what we can learn from other places. So those are our three panelists. It's always great to have panelists on. Extra big thanks today because for Stu, I think it's quite late in the evening where he's based on the other side of the world, and for Jenny, it's very early in the morning, given that she is in the US. So an extra big thanks to my panelists. What we're going to try and do to the best that we can is try to split this conversation into at least two parts, although it'll probably go the way that it's going to go. So I think in the first part, Ant's going to kick us off. Be useful just to get a sense as to where we are, what the UK plan system currently is, what some of the issues associated with it are, and therefore how that sets up an argument or a rationale for at least exploring moving towards a zone-based system. And then I'll get Jenny and Stu to give us a picture as to when we think about zone-based systems elsewhere, where are they? How prevalent are they? What are their main characteristics? That's kind of part one. So a bit of description. And then in part two, it's really to get under the skin of that and really think about these systems, where they operate. How do they operate? Do they operate well? What would we need to learn? And if we were telling or informing the UK government that didn't want to move towards a zone-based system, what are the lessons that we can draw from these systems elsewhere, and how can we make the best of it? So that's the sort of rough structure for the session. If you've got questions or comments, queries as we're going along, as always, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will feed them into the conversation as appropriate. So that's really how we're going to do it. And you kick us off. Just give us a sense as to where we are in the UK at least, and then I say we'll go to Jenny and then to Stu.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Jenny and Stu, for joining us today. So around the world, planning systems are really traditionally divided into two types. You've got zoning systems are one type, and discretionary systems are another type. So most countries around the world have zoning systems, but in the UK, in England, and each of the devolved nations, we have a discretionary planning system. So just to kind of unpack that a bit, a zoning system is really characterized by rules-based decision-making, ideally. So in a zoning system, neighborhoods will be assigned to different zones in the local plan, and those zones will have different rules on density and on building uses. So for instance, you might have in a local authority a suburban zone that allows for houses, small apartment buildings, little shops and pubs. And conversely, a city centre zone might have skyscrapers and nightclubs and hotels. Similarly, it might also have an industrial zone that allows for polluting or nuisance uses that are nevertheless important to the local economy. And crucially, in theory, under a zoning system, if you make a planning application that follows the rules of the zone, then you should be guaranteed planning permission, right? Discretionary systems don't work in that way. They're different. They have much more judgment-based decision-making rather than rules-based decision-making. So there may be rules in the local plan, but they're much more a matter of interpretation and discretion than a zoning system. So what this means is that in a discretionary system, even if you do follow the rules of the local plan, then you may still be denied planning permission. And that's deliberate, as everything is supposed to be decided case by case in a discretionary planning system. So for instance, in England, even if planning officers recommend a proposal or an application for approval, it then goes to a committee of elected councillors who may decide that it's actually not in compliance with the local plan. And that's designed as a feature rather than a bug. It's designed to have that discretion and that judgment-based decision-making built into it. Now, I think just at a kind of a high level, I think in terms of planning reform, house building outcomes and similar, I think that has two really big effects. So the first is that this obviously reduces house building and development and urban change, as the system is more restrictive, it's less predictable, and it generally empowers NIMBY forces within local government. But I think the second element, which is almost just as important, I think even more important for policymakers discussing reform, is it makes planning reform much harder, as you can change the rules in a discretionary system, but it might not change planning or house building all that much because the rules don't matter as much as they do in zoning systems. So I think even aside, I think from kind of the details of, what exactly a zoning code looks like, if we broadly want to have a system which has higher house building, has better urban outcomes, and can actually have a more structured debate about planning reform, we should be thinking about moving towards a zoning system to try and unlock those benefits.
Great, thanks very much. And there's got a good summary, I guess, in terms of where we are in the country, particularly in the UK, in terms of the discretionary system and maybe the limits of such a system that Anne's raised. Jenny, let's come to you next, and then I come to Stu. But you look at planning systems around the globe. Obviously, you're based in the US. There's a lot of places in the US with variations on a zone-based system. I mean, how prevalent are they? What are their sort of main characteristics from a descriptive point of view? How would you introduce zone-based systems? I guess any major differences from the discretionary systems, which also exist not only in the UK but in other places as well. How would you describe?
I'd actually talk about it less as sort of a binary discretionary system versus a zone-based system and more of a continuum, because most of the US has zoning. So parcels are assigned to some kind of a zone, residential or commercial or industrial, and have some rules. But there's a lot of variation in how much discretion there is under those systems. So the sort of early versions of zoning in the US in the kind of 1940s and 50s, almost everything was allowed as of right or by ministerial approval. So if you could build houses or you could build apartments, it was a very straightforward rules-based system. And so the rules were written out and you have to check all of the following boxes, minimum lot size and maximum building height and so forth. But if you check those boxes, the property owner could essentially walk into the buildings department, put down their plan, pay their fees, get their permit, and go start building. Starting in the late 60s and 1970s, within this zoning system, we moved towards a much more discretionary approach. So there has to be at least one use that is still allowed as of right. In residential areas, that is almost always single-family detached homes. Anything else requires either a change of zoning or some kind of a special permission, and there are lots of different names for this. But so, for instance, we have a lot of suburbs that have single-family detached homes, but if you want to add an accessory dwelling unit, a granny flat in your backyard, then you need to go through a special permission process, which I think is quite similar to the UK. You go in front of whatever the local body is and make your case and give a presentation, and you may or may not be granted permission for this. We still have a lot of as of right zoning that's allowed mostly in undeveloped land on the fringes of cities. Developed areas closer to the urban core generally has something on it already. And so most of the infill development has to go through a discretionary process, because what you're trying to do is change zoning that may have been developed 20 or 30 years ago around structures that currently exist. So that's sort of where we have run into the limits. And I will say, for sort of forward planning in the UK, putting in place zoning rules that match what's currently built on the land will almost immediately constrain you. So, you need to be updating the zoning periodically once you hit whatever the cap is, the number of homes that you can fit or the building height or whatever the envelope is. Then in order to create more capacity as of right, you have to go back and revisit the zoning and upgrade to higher density, add in different kinds of uses. And that's where we have sort of fallen short. The US put into place zoning in the 1950s and hasn't really updated it.
Yeah, that's a great point in a sense of thinking about, you're thinking about obviously where you are and the immediate pressures, but you also try to be mindful about the fact that places are often changing, some changing quite rapidly as they go through cycles of growth or change. And so being able to have an eye to the medium term, not just to the immediate term, I think is really a good point. Just Jenny, so one of the concerns I suppose is, there's no discretion in a zone-based system. I think you've just flatly kind of squashed that concern, which is good, because I think that's one of the reasons people feel nervous about zone-based systems. It gives the power to the thing rather than to the human to make those decisions. That's obviously not true. But just say a little bit about, can we think about what determines the amount of discretion relative to the amount of rule? Is it very, very idiosyncratic, place by place, state by state, city by city, or are there sort of generalizable trends or patterns that you see in terms of how much discretion is in there relative to how much rule is in there, as it were?
Yeah, there's a lot of variation in how much discretion and who gets to exercise the discretion at what point in the development process. So the US is a federal system. State governments are the ones who have primary authority over land use and planning. So each state sets the rules for local governments to operate, and then local governments get to set the planning and zoning within that. So there's enormous variation. We have 3,000 counties and 40,000 cities and towns. So we have, close to 45,000 different systems all over the map in terms of how much discretion they have. And there are sort of layers of regulations, some of which are more discretionary than others. Part of the difficulty is that the rules are enforced by different kinds of entities. So within a city, you have a zoning code, which is generally overseen by a planning department. You have a building code, which is overseen by the buildings department. We have fire safety codes that are enforced by the fire department. And so you have to go through multiple different authorities. So even things that should be fairly straightforward, like fire code, you have to talk to a different entity and get sign off. And I think Ant's discussion of it's a feature, not a bug, building the discretion into local government agencies gives them a lot of power to negotiate for things that they want or don't want.
Right.
And so in many cases, what we actually see is that local governments that might want development, but they also want the developer to pay for things like upgrades to the streets and the water and sewer, the park systems. They will intentionally set the rules to be more restrictive than what they really would like to see built. And then there's a negotiation process will allow you to build taller buildings or add more units, but only if you're going to give us a neighborhood park and you pay for that. So again, this is a very intentional strategy of assigning power to the local government. In some cases, it's assigned essentially to the neighbors who currently live in the community. So an open community process gives a lot of political power to longstanding residents who will show up and complain about things. That's also very much a feature because the longstanding residents are the ones who vote in local elections.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. With lots to come back on that, which we'll get into the detail of it. But Stu, you've been looking at systems. You're particularly have been particularly involved and focused on what's been going on in New Zealand and the Auckland reforms, etc. So just for those that are less familiar, just say a little bit about that system and how it's changed from, I guess, or evolved from one thing to, more towards something else in terms of the planning system.
Yeah, so we have a zone-based system, not too dissimilar to what Jenny described for the US. So for Auckland, for example, at the moment, there's about 4 residential zones that vary from single detached dwellings through to, townhouses and apartment zones. And so you can go to a map of Auckland and you can enter your address and it will immediately tell you what the zone is that applies to your property. So I guess the journey that Auckland's been on is that it effectively upzoned a large amount of its land, about 3/4, 75% of the urban area was upzoned. It was a very broad upzoning, but it was quite modest in its scale. So, you know, the townhouse and apartment zone is sort of 3 to 5 stories. It's not, you know, it's not very, very dense. But that had a significant effect on housing, and we can come back to that. I think one thing I was reflecting on is that in the New Zealand context, which is quite similar at the local government level to the UK, you know, we have regional councils and local councils. The zones are determined locally. So each local council can come up with its own zones, but increasingly over the last 10 years, central government has been setting minimum standards for what needs to be enabled in certain areas or locations where central government decides it has an interest. So that is, you know, that's leading to policies around, you have to allow at least 6 stories around transit, for example. And so you can have any other zone, you can have other zoning rules, but you have to have a height limit of at least 6 stories. And that kind of mix of central direction and local influence, I think, might be quite suitable to the UK, you know. And the other thing is, just to back up Jenny's point, is that I look at our zoning systems that we have in Australia and New Zealand, and don't get me wrong, they're not perfect, but they do allow for both zoning and direction and certainty while also allowing discretion. Yeah. So, you know, if you want to propose something that doesn't meet the zoning codes in the New Zealand context, you can, and then it will be assessed usually based on its effects. And, you know, there's a lot of case law and stuff like that. So it kind of reverts at that point to more of a discretionary common law type setting. As opposed to the rules-based setting.
That's interesting. And Stu, just in terms of the move to upzone and introduce, you know, some of that kind of greater density in certain places, more variety, you know, just give a sense of the scale of how significant was that as a move in the planning system in New Zealand? Was it a modification? Was it incremental? Or, you know, how should we think about that introduction of that thinking and the upzone decision? Was it a big move? And I guess why it came about in part because of the housing pressures, right?
Yeah, it really is a situation where it arose, the need for the new rules arose from the amalgamation of councils. So Auckland used to be 7 separate councils, and then they were amalgamated into one, covering about 1.5 million people and an enormous area. So that created the need for a new set of planning rules. And that timeline overlapped with, I guess, this explosion of public and political interest in housing affordability. So it was something we were talking on about before the call, is that Auckland and New Zealand has done very well at building houses lately, but historically not so well. And so, you know, they have a housing crisis, they still have a housing crisis, and they're building a lot more houses at the moment to sort of, that's helping to get on top of it. But yeah, the general sense is that the council had to come up with a new set of zoning rules, but they were very much forced to upzone more than they wanted. So I think that's an important point, is that the reason Auckland upzoned is not because the council voluntarily decided to enable a lot more housing. There was a planning process where central government had a lot of input, and they said housing affordability is a big policy issue for us. And we want you to enable more, and so that is how that came about.
Yeah, well, we can't, like Jenny raised the sort of in a slightly different way as to where the mandate comes from and who's mandating what and to whom, which we'll come back to in a second. But and just to bring you back in, still in the sort of descriptive space. Obviously, as I said in my introduction, you've done a lot on where we are in the UK and how that might change. And in part, your work has been informed by looking at examples elsewhere. So just give us, round out when we think about places like Japan, which you've done a lot of thinking about and look at work on, which is obviously a different context again. Anything you'd want to add in terms of how the systems work typically from a zone, when we think about the zoning systems, just to round it out, and then we'll get into some of these questions about how we encourage and facilitate change, who provides the mandate, the standards, etc.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think, I was presenting an idealized type earlier between kind of maybe that 1940s zoning style system and then maybe a 1940s discretionary system as maybe exists on statute. In practice, both Jenny and Stu are right that, we do see a mix of discretion and certainty in all planning systems. And, in practice, it's where you sit in that spectrum then determines how easy it is to build and how easy it is to undertake planning reform. I mean, from my observations, it definitely seems that zoning systems tend to make this strong distinction between the underlying zone, which allows by right development, as Jenny said, but it will often overlay this zoning with perhaps discretionary designations. So you might have a historical preservation zone on top of a apartment zone that then means you have to have particular attention to maybe its design, maybe it's more discretionary in terms of the types of buildings that you can demolish and replace and build up to. Even if nominally you are allowed to build up to quite high density, it might in practice still be quite restrictive. I think, this potentially has some lessons, I think, for the UK. If we decide that actually we want to have a fundamental zone-based system everywhere, we can still have and create these designations which allow in special areas to have that kind of discretion when we want to. But I think just coming back to kind of Stu's point there, talking about upzoning all of or 3/4 of Auckland to allow for greater density and for more house building inside the urban area, that's something that discretionary systems really struggle with. It's really very difficult for national policymakers or indeed local policymakers in the UK to change the rules and allow for that large increase in the envelope of developable land, kind of as Jenny was saying, that you really need to have in a planning system to keep housing affordable, to keep construction going, and to allow urban change to occur.
Yeah. Jenny, let's think about changes. So you obviously talked about America, and housing affordability, particularly in some places, is now a much hotter topic, a much more political topic at the national level as well as the state and local level than it has been, for a while. So are you seeing quite a bit of now pressure and demand to reform some of the systems in different parts of the US to respond to this, these sharpening problems? Because I think that's, is there a pressure? Where is it coming from? How did it manifest itself? And I'll ask you to say something about that in terms of, where did the pressure to deal with the problems come from, and how did it manifest itself? And we can get into the issue, because I think it's a similar question in the UK, which is affordability in general, and affordability certainly in some places is more of an issue today, politically, standard of living, cost of living pressures, etc., than it has been for quite some time. So Jenny, just say a little bit about the pressure, but then how are places, are they responding? Who's doing the hard yards in terms of proposing the changes?
Short answer is yes. This has become a much more politically sensitive and salient issue, particularly in the last 5 years, than we've ever seen. So parts of the US, particularly the Northeast Corridor, New York, Boston, California, Seattle, have been really expensive and really supply constrained for decades. So, California has been underbuilding for about 40 years. And as Stu mentioned, with New Zealand, it really has dug itself into a deficit. And so they've been sort of trying to figure out how to undo a lot of their bad policies with marginal success, I would say. But in the last 5 years, we have just seen an explosion of state governments getting into the game, trying to set either to overrule local governments, set some sort of a mandate for the number of houses that need to be built, or overrule specific kinds of zoning rules. There's a lot of experimentation going on, so it's hard to kind of categorize everything. I'd say the two broad tendencies for states are either to override very specific rules. We've seen, I think, close to a dozen states that have set statewide rules around accessory dwelling units. So these are the small granny flats. It's the very lightest touch of density. It's not going to change a lot, but it's allowing a little bit more flexibility. politically, that has been the most appealing track. And so a number of states are just setting rules and saying local governments cannot prohibit accessory dwelling units in residential areas, and then some additional rules around that. The other approach is to set sort of broader guidelines for the number of homes that need to be built. So this is a really interesting approach that, here's the target number you have to build, but each locality can decide how to do that. Do you want to upzone around transit to quite high densities? Do you want to do small increases in density, sort of like Auckland, and do that citywide? And so there's a fair amount of flexibility. Both California and Oregon now have this kind of system of allocating a target and localities needing to figure out how to respond to that. The sort of third approach is to do very kind of geographically targeted upzoning. Massachusetts has a state law now that requires all of the communities that have rapid transit, either bus rapid transit or commuter rail or subway, to upzone and allow apartments within some proximity of the transit station. That is being challenged by one of the localities that doesn't want to comply and is going to the state Supreme Court next month. So that will be a really interesting sort of decision to see whether that's upheld. And I will say that for the first time, I think ever in a presidential campaign, Kamala Harris has put out a housing plan that says we are short 3 million new homes. We need to make this a target and be building towards that. And we need to, the federal government needs to incentivize state and local governments to change their rules and build more homes. We have never had a presidential campaign that has talked about housing supply. The federal government has very limited kinds of powers in this area, and so they're going to have to move very slowly and cautiously. But that it has even gotten to the level of national political conversation, it's a huge change.
That's encouraging. And so it is not exclusively, but it's primarily at the state level that we see some of these changes. So it's California encouraging Los Angeles and San Francisco to do more. It's New York State encouraging New York City to do a bit more, and so on and so on. It's primarily at that kind of scale where we see this kind of push for reform, particularly reform to get more stuff built. Is that a crude simplification? Yeah.
Yes. So yes, and partly this is noteworthy because most states have done nothing on zoning and land use before. They delegated to localities and then just stood back with their hands off. And so now more than a dozen states have either passed something or proposed something, which is a sea change. The federal government is interested in doing something. There are a handful of bills that are sort of bubbling around in Congress. No surprise here, Congress is probably not going to pass any of them, but Congress is also thinking about very kind of small and targeted things. There's a version of the YIMBY movement called YIGBY, Yes in God's Backyard. So Congress is debating whether faith-based institutions should be allowed to develop, for instance, affordable housing on land that they already own as part of their social purpose. That's the sort of very, very narrowly targeted thing that might be able to get through Congress, although I wouldn't bet on it. But otherwise, this is primarily going to be action at the state level. Some localities are also doing these reforms voluntarily because of pressure from their constituents. Right. But again, because there's so many of them, even if a handful of localities get it right, they're surrounded by an ocean of neighbors with terrible zoning.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Right, Stu, similar sort of question, really. Where is the mandate coming from? You talked about it's the New Zealand government that is always been pushed. Just say a little bit more. Why, and then how did they interact with places like Auckland to, I suppose, to encourage them to do more than they may wish to do if they were left to their own devices? And how has that played out?
I'm really glad you asked this question because I spent most of the last two weeks trying to figure it out. So what I did is I went back through parliamentary records and I counted the number of times that housing was mentioned in the Minister of Finance's annual budget speech. And that's quite a nice thing to analyze from a word perspective because it's about the same length every year. And what I found is that the frequency with which housing was mentioned in the Minister of Finance's budget speech to Parliament increased threefold in around 2011. So what seems to have happened is that New Zealand has had a sort of housing crisis bubbling along beneath the surface for a long time. there was some great work done by the Productivity Commission in New Zealand and some inquiries into housing affordability. They published their report. The government was obliged to respond, and to their credit, they did. I think they really recognized the problem. And so from 2011, 2012 on, housing became a much more topical issue at a political level. What I found interesting is that over the next 5 years, that was a centre-right government at the time. They advanced a lot of reforms, and they were making progress, I think it's fair to say, but they still fell behind public opinion. So by around about 2017, public opinion had shifted so far in favor of more radical action on housing policy that this government, which had actually been doing and advancing quite a lot of reforms for about 5 years, that appeared to be showing up in increased rates of building, they found themselves behind that public opinion curve. And I'm not a political strategist, but my reading of this and my advice to political parties like UK Labour would be very careful not to move too slow and too cautiously on housing affordability issue, because it can really get away from you quickly.
And it takes a long time to deal with, right?
It does take time. I mean, these reforms in New Zealand were very effective, quite quickly, but it is a couple of years. And of course, it's a couple more years before the average person on the ground might actually feel some tangible difference in the rent that they're paying and that sort of thing. Yeah. So that was something I've just been looking into the last 2 weeks, and that research will hopefully be public soon. But yeah, that was sort of, I think, this nexus between institutions like the Productivity Commission, civil society groups like, Brookings in the US, but there's sort of New Zealand equivalents, and also researchers, and this kind of broad coalition came together, and it got to the point where in 2017, there was an election, and housing was the #1 issue mentioned in voter surveys of voters. And I found that remarkable.
Yeah.
I was very happy as a housing researcher, of course. But housing went from being something that basically central government didn't talk about at all to being something that they just talked about all the time. And so I think I found that very interesting.
And so when they made their move and the the government said we need to think about how we address this issue, increasing density, or basically increasing the supply, the provision of housing was the obvious way to go, and began to introduce these kinds of things. What was the how did they interact with, say, Auckland in that sense? And what were the tensions?
Well, I think
system, was Auckland resistant? Why were they just say a little bit around that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Auckland was very resistant, but central government was very persistent, and I think got it over the line. So I think central government saw the Auckland reform, or sort of planning reforms or amalgamation, as an opportunity to address this issue that was becoming very politically problematic for them. But I think the success of Auckland, because of what happened in Auckland, because it was successful, that motivated them to look nationally. And so they were like, okay, Auckland, we've got on top of that problem to an extent, but I think these lessons have some relevance to other councils. And so what central government started to do in 2016, 2017 is come up with national direction. So a little bit like what Jenny was saying at the state level in the US, this national direction is basically saying to councils, you have to have targets. Housing is a national issue. And what was interesting around that time is that policies started to recognize the tension between local interests and national interests on housing, and how local interests were very much captured by incumbents, the existing residents, and that was problematic at a national level.
Yeah.
And I think just recognizing that, and that actually, I think local councils, a lot of them if you would ask them, they'd honestly admit that they struggle to reflect the needs of future residents, because their political incentives are all about the current incumbents.
Yeah. And that touches on
that was a shift.
And that touches on Jenny's point right at the beginning, which is, if you think about, for zoning systems to work, you need to be thinking about the future as well as the present, and that not just from a change perspective, but actually it's future residents as well as existing residents, and systems do find that difficult to incorporate the future into the current. That's a great point. And just come in on this, in a sense, the work that we've been doing and we think about very much sort of picks up on the points that Jenny was making, particularly recognizing in the UK context, particularly there is a requirement and a role for national government, as well as a role obviously for localities then to engage if we move towards a system. But just say a little bit more around how that fits in with what Jenny and Stuart just said.
Yeah, sure things. I think that dynamic of having like an upper tier jurisdiction, whether that's state government or a national government, as the referee of the planning system, with local governments as the players, is really important. So you need to have that distinction where something above is setting the rules, and then something below is actually implementing those rules, applying them at the local level. I think that's really important for reflecting that future need and maintaining the pressure to change planning rules as needs change over time. I think obviously that brings into question these arguments about democracy, right? In terms of planning for a local area, is it legitimate for civil servants far away in the capital to come in and say, no, your local plan is invalid, we're going to come in and overrule that? I think what this gets to is there's always going to be debates at the national level or the state level about what the rules are. And I think there's always going to be similar debates at the local level about how we apply those rules, what places get upzoned, what places get developed. But we really shouldn't be having very many debates about whether the rules should even matter in the first place. And I think part of the problem we're having in the UK is that because our system is fundamentally discretionary, it's built into the statute that, any other material considerations, pretty much anything at all that is mentioned in the local plan can be used to deny or accept a planning permission, and that's the fundamental basis of the system, means that we can't have these structured conversations and structured reforms that we're seeing in the United States, but also in New Zealand and other parts around the world as well.
Yeah, it's a great point. That's a great point. The nature of the conversation we need to have is constrained by, anyway, I think that's a very, very good point. No system is perfect. There's good and bad in all systems. And if you move to a different system, there's some bad stuff in that. Stu, you start with you and then Jenny come in and if we were to move towards more of a zone-based system in the UK, what from your experience of looking at these systems, how they work, let's start with the goods. We'll come on to the bads, in recognition of trying to kind of balance. But in terms of the goods of more of a zone system, what have you seen in the New Zealand and Australian context? What are the real, if we were selling it to politicians who would say, like, is it worth it? Why should I do it? This is all hassle. Let's just do some tinkering at the edges, because zoning would be a significant change in the UK. What are the pluses? And we'll get into the minuses, but what are the pluses that you would be sort of laying down on a piece of paper for them?
Oh, I think certainty is the big plus, and certainty both for developers and for residents, right? Because in a discretionary system, I know it tends to be more restrictive, but there's probably high variance, and I think what a zoning-based system gives you is some certainty over, what sort of development will be allowed where, and a lot of our discussions and policy debates in New Zealand are about maybe we should be enabling more, and so that's sort of something that I've been pushing for. But at least you have an understanding. In the Auckland context, for example, the initial council proposals were for about 300,000 more dwellings, and the feedback from independent planning experts was you actually need to provide double that. You need to allow capacity for about 600,000 dwellings. You couldn't have those conversations if you didn't have a zoning system where you had some understanding of what the underlying building envelopes were and how much housing could be provided, right? So you can actually do those calculations and have those conversations. From a developer's perspective, you can look at a map and you can see where the high development intensity sites are in a city. And of course, they'll usually be in centers and around transit and around amenities like schools and parks and beaches and community facilities and things like that. So I think that certainty and the direction that you as a council can provide to where development happens, actually gives certainty to the council around public services, right? So they you know, there's through their zoning, they shape the urban form, and then they can say, well, we can also plan around that. So I think it helps both sides actually. It just I was talking to Andy about this before, like you need to encourage. I don't think it's actually as big of a step in a way as it sounds. I know legally it probably is, but what you're asking planners to do is to go one step further. So at the moment in the UK, you have a lot of policy principles, but you don't actually take that through to say, what does that mean on the ground in terms of what people can build? And so in the New Zealand and Australian context, we still have policy principles for the zones around what the zones are trying to achieve, but they then go one step further and say, this is what you're allowed to do, this is what you might be allowed to do, and this is what you can't do. So I think, yeah, those are the key benefits. You have very clear conversations with developers, with the community, and plan on
Very
that
good.
basis.
Okay, Jenny, come in. What's the big plus, as it will put big pluses? Certainty across the piece, clarity in terms of what is or what's not. What would you add to that?
Yeah, I think along with certainty, it provides transparency, and that can make the planning process more fair and less open to nefarious actions on the part of both local governments and developers. So particularly if you move to a system of as of right development and the zones are laid out on maps that are available for the public to look at across the entire city, then you no longer have the possibility for there's a developer who always manages to get their proposals through, and there are other developers who don't, and it's because of relationships or it's because of payoffs. So a rules-based system, I would argue for it on kind of a good government basis that encourages honesty and fair play by local authorities. And I think Stu's point also that it's not just the zoning, it's combining the zoning and the planning. So in order to develop the zones and write the rules into place in the first place, you have to do this act of planning for future growth, planning for public services, for infrastructure. So looking at the areas where the city wants to encourage development of various kinds, maybe redeveloping some blighted areas. What is it going to take? Forecasting what is this going to do for demand on your school systems, on your roads, on your water and sewer systems. So, in a sense, forcing communities to look at that and start to make some long-term plans and then align the zoning with all of the other things that local governments do. And I don't know how your local governments do their planning and forecasting for services, sort of in isolation of not knowing where growth is likely to happen. But I think that makes their jobs easier. Or maybe they don't.
No, that's very good. So certainty, clarity, we've got transparency, we've got actually reintroduces some agency for the actors in the system that maybe more so, and round off on the goods, and then
Yeah.
I'll get Stu to come in and start us off on things we should be mindful about, the bads or things that we would want to keep an eye on. So just finish off on the goods.
Yeah, sure thing. I completely agree with Stu and Jenny. I think kind of more certainty, for residents, and also having more capital P planning in the process are really big benefits. I mean, just on kind of the politics of it, I think sometimes you kind of hear people say, oh no, like we can't move towards a zoning system in the UK. It's too politically difficult. Actually, the politically easy option is to make small incremental changes inside the current planning system, because that's politically easier. I think actually I would flip that completely the other way around. I think that the political benefit of having a big R planning reform to move to zoning is you do one big change, you front load that into the front part of your government when the politics are easier, when your mandate is stronger. And then once the new system has been passed in legislation, actually then a lot of the political pain that the housing crisis is causing and the planning process is causing drains away, right? If you instead take an incremental approach, you're trying to get the discretionary system working a bit better to squeeze out a bit more housing nationally over that entire period of government. What that means is every day you go into your office in central government, you are thinking about ways to try and bully local governments to try and build more houses, even though they don't want to, and paying a huge political price every day for your term in government to try and achieve that. So I think part of it is it's about almost an investment of your political capital that then produces dividends over the rest of your time in government, rather than trying to kind of fight fires day by day.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Stu, so let's do a bit of the bads. What should we be worried about, or what should we keep an eye on? You know, what would we be advising the UK? Before you answer that, we've had quite a lot of questions. I think it's quite a straightforward, yes, you can. Quite a few questions on how do we maintain quality? How do we maintain design excellence, whatever that might mean? You know, in a zone-based system, can it be done? Is the kind of broad sentiment of several questions. I guess the answer is yes, you can. If that's what you want to do, then you can introduce those into the zone requirements or into, you know, different aspects of the new system, right? It's not like those things are mutually exclusive. Is that what you would say as well?
Yeah, so typically, I mean, in New Zealand, the sort of resource consent zoning rules can refer to design guidelines and things like that. So you can have urban design guidelines, architectural guidelines.
Good.
I should mention building standards are a completely separate piece of legislation. So there's no implication for building quality, safety, structural integrity, stuff like that. That's a completely separate piece of legislation, and that legislation applies nationally.
Yeah, I think there's a general worry that a zone system is essentially a free for all to do whatever you want, you know, or for whatever developers want to do.
Yeah.
And that's
absolutely not the case.
Conceptually, that's an error. So we need to get away from that and right.
Exactly.
So that's not that's not a problem. Give me your sense. You know, what should we be thinking about? Or be worried about? Keep an eye on. You know, the sort of downsides of if we move towards that system.
The problem is more the other end of that comment around is actually zoning systems in New Zealand and Australia can become too prescriptive. So they become too specific about the sorts of things that you have to deliver. Example would be the separation of sort of land use activities that are perceived to be not complementary, but actually are very complementary. So over the last sort of 2 decades, you've seen a transition back towards more mixed use zoning. So the industrial activities are still separated for fairly obvious reasons, but commercial, retail, and residential is now sort of there's a push to allow those to mix a bit more. And that's actually gone through to the national level. So the recent announcements in New Zealand are about requiring mixed use zoning in a large parts of cities, and that's building actually quite a bit from the Japanese experience with their cities and their zoning. So yeah, that would be the one thing I would guard against. I think is not letting them become too prescriptive. I think retaining some national direction around sort of minimum standards of zoning that you expect around transit, at least for things that your central government or your state government are funding. You know, so that's been the key driver in New Zealand, where there's sort of cross-party support for central government to intervene in local planning decisions, is to say you have to upzone around transit, because we're paying a lot of those costs for that transit, you know. And you know, there's other examples of that. So yeah, the bad, I guess the other potential bad, and this is something for you to think about, this is an attribute of the Japanese system, is when you allow zones to be determined locally, so not just like where they apply, but what the zones are, you actually get this fragmentation of your planning system. So if you're a developer and you want to build a certain style of apartment building, it becomes very hard to operate across different councils because you have completely different zoning systems. And one of the big advantages of the Japanese approach, where they set zones nationally, is that it facilitates sort of large-scale construction companies and architectural firms to do their thing, you know, and they know that if they comply with this residential zone in Tokyo, then they will also comply in that same zone in another city. And so that's something to look out for, is just overwhelming complexity at the local level, because every council thinks they have the right approach, and there's, you know, and you want to allow for that local input, but there is a value in direction, central.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We're not going to get into that today, I don't think, but you know, it touches on, you know, thinking about the scale, the meta scale that you're trying to do the zoning system over, you know, and whether that corresponds with the labor market, and therefore you can have a fuller, rounder view on what's required in different parts of that labour market and vis-a-vis, you know, suburbs versus centres, etc., etc. That's a very good point. Jenny, give us we would definitely lean towards being too prescriptive in this country, by the way, absolutely no doubt. But we would be leaning heavily into, you know, down to the whatever it is, the finite announcement. We would need to manage that. But still, I think we can. Jenny, what other things should we be alert to and worried about? Keep an eye on.
So I think 3 things to watch. One is that when you first draw up the zones, that they don't reinforce existing inequalities. So the US, when we drew our first zoning maps in the 40s and 50s, cities sort of drew a circle around the area that was predominantly African American and said this is the apartment zone or the industrial zone, and the mostly white single family neighborhoods become single family low density and become preserved. And so a lot of the zoning maps essentially reinforce existing racial and economic disparities, and then lock those in for very long periods of time, including the mostly white owner-occupied neighborhoods. No commercial activity was allowed, and so industrial and commercial activity and polluting things were basically pushed into lower income immigrant and Black neighborhoods. So, you know, be very aware of that. The point I brought up earlier that if the zoning matches what's on the ground now, you're going to hit your capacity immediately. Zoning needs to be updated on a pretty regular basis, and that can be painful. That can be politically difficult to go through, but it has to be done. I mean, just plan on every 10 to 15 years, it needs to be revisited and adjusted. And then the overly prescriptive thing, I think it deserves to be said again. You get down to, you know, the minimum lot size, the minimum house size, and the setbacks and the width, and you know, even the design standards and the review process. So the fussier it gets, the harder it will become to have any kind of certainty.
And is that a sort of natural law that, you know, the law that you just, you know, there's just something immutable about the move towards prescription? Is that your experience, Jenny, or you know, can we what do we know? How do we hold back from that?
My experience has been that cities that have a lot of diversity in their architectural styles and building structures and different kinds of buildings next to one another already, people know that that's okay. The real problem is sort of the large greenfields development. There's very much the expectation that, you know, a developer is going to build a subdivision with 5,000 houses and they need to be identical down to the blade of grass, which then creates this sort of very artificial environment. But even in urban areas, you wind up getting rules that enforce uniformity so that the new things that get built all look the same, because that's the only thing that the rules are going to allow. And then people complain, why are all of the new apartment buildings identical? It's because those are the rules that you wrote.
Yeah, no, very good. And I know you've written a lot in favor of, but now is you have to put yourself, you know, against yourself and sort of what are the things that, you know, that you've thought about rightly, that no system is perfect. If we were doing it in the UK, what would we need to focus on? What would we be worried about?
So I think, particularly in the UK context, one difference that we have, I think, particularly in the US and a lot of Anglophone countries, is we have a particular complex around urban growth and about building new suburbs on the outskirts of cities. This tends to be less controversial in other parts of the world. In the UK, because of the Green Belt, it's an intensely controversial issue and has all kinds of compounding negative impacts for the economy, for housing affordability, etc. I think what we would expect is that zoning would have the biggest benefits and effects on infill development, so building within existing urban areas. However, I think some of the research or some of the kind of experiences, I think maybe New Zealand is partly this as well. I think even parts of the United States, if you try to deliver your entire housing strategy through densification and through urban infill, you really risk a NIMBY backlash at some point, if not inevitable, from people who see their amenity and urban areas change to meet the change in housing supply that's needed solely for existing urban areas. We do need to be thinking in the UK about urban expansion as well. I think zoning can help with that. It can make it easier to kind of do land value capture methods, to master plan for new urban extensions. So it doesn't necessarily make urban expansion harder, but we do need to be very clear-eyed if we do adopt a zoning system that we're doing both densification and urban expansion as well.
Very good. That's a good realistic view. So we've got a couple of minutes to go. So for a bit of fun, we thought we'd have a poll of the people on the call just to see whether what Jenny and Stu and Ant have been saying, has it changed your mind? Has it confirmed your biases one way or another? So just for a bit of fun, and we get very quick fire responses from three. Let's have our question. So our question is, have today's speakers, Jenny, Stu, and Ant, have they convinced you that the future of planning in the UK should be a zone-based system? So we recognise, we may not have convinced you, but you already might have been there. So I was already convinced, still am. Yes, you are now convinced. No, you are not convinced. You weren't convinced, and you're still unsure. So four good options. Just, we're not going to hold you to it. It's a bit of fun, but it's always interesting to see where people are. So we can't vote, so we can't influence that either way. But let's see the answers. And I get Jenny and Stu and Ant to give like 30 seconds on a quick reply. There we go. Look. So level pegging. So I was already convinced, still am. You've confirmed the biases of some. I wasn't convinced, but not now unsure. I was convinced, but now unsure. You haven't at least talked anybody out of it, or at least one person out of it. But you convinced of the zombie system, and there's a sort of split. I suppose. Thank you for that. If we can, I suppose that's I don't know. It's partly about the politics of this, Jenny, as much as the sort of detail. I mean, give us your final thought on that in terms of the politics of what we're talking technocratic and sometimes institutional type conversations.
Yeah,
as you were saying, there's a politics of this we can't get away from, right?
You can't get away from politics, so you might as well embrace it and figure out how to manage it. I think Stu's point earlier that it's going to take time to fix this. It's going to take a long time to build enough homes. There's a danger of not meeting the public's demands quickly enough. I would say in particular, there's a danger of over-promising and under-delivering.
Yeah.
So if you do relatively modest reforms, or promise that you will cure the housing crisis in 5 years and you don't, that would be terrible. I would say also, I love that the Labour government is embracing this. There is potentially some risk if it becomes too affiliated with the Labour Party of having a backlash if the government changes. This is something that I worry about quite a bit actually in the US. I don't want this to be a Democratic issue. I would love for Donald Trump to put forward a national housing platform and talk about zoning reform also, because the only way you're going to make progress is to have some continuity across changes of government. Yeah, very good. Stu, can't get away from the politics, right?
No, you can't. My experience is that so in countries where you have a majority of homeowners, you need to convince a chunk of them that it's in their interests. And the message that I saw resonate in New Zealand from 2012 onwards was really about young people and families. And so, there's a chunk of homeowners and people who you might think are otherwise happy to not have development, who seem to swing in behind the sort of pro-housing reforms like zoning reform in the UK. When they realize that their children might live overseas, and that maybe not so much of a problem in the US, it's a bigger country, but in countries like New Zealand, it's very common for young people to move overseas. And I think that became a very salient issue with a chunk of people who might normally not be so persuaded by this kind of technocratic discussion. So yeah, that would be my thing, is a bit like Jenny, try and build as broad a coalition as you can that crosses the spectrum. Yeah.
And that's the thing we see very briefly, and that's what we see in the UK, right? There's sort of a growing alliance that spans different interests, different places, but particularly incorporates, some of the younger folk that are typically badly affected by the housing problems we now see in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. I often say it's not an ideological issue; it's a generational issue, right? You'll meet, young people who are kind of in the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrat Party, and the Conservative Party, who might disagree, absolutely furious ways about every other issue. But everyone there is facing really high rents and can't get on the housing ladder. And there is, I think, now a shared recognition that the discretionary planning system we have in the UK is part of the problem. It's not a coincidence. We have an unusually discretionary and dysfunctional system and unusually bad housing outcomes. And that actually, if we, did big R planning reforms, if we move towards a zoning system, that's not a scary thing. You know, most other developed countries around the world have this kind of system. We don't have to be exceptional. We don't have to be, you know, tearing up all the red tape. We just have to be normal.
Very good. I claimed a call to be normal. I think I would completely endorse that. We need to finish. Massive thanks to Jenny and Stu, not least because it's early and late in your respective time zones. So thank you very much for making the time to come on the event. It's been brilliant. And obviously thanks to Ant as well. You can get all the work that we've been doing on housing on our website, sevencities.org. Thank you all for joining. Until the next time, take care. And